Hello, and welcome to another amazing episode of Finding the Superpowers Within. I am your host, Dr. April J. Lisbon, autism coach and strategist. I am super excited to have today's guest. His name is Mr. Alexander Tallman. Alex is a millennial who, I'm not even going to tell you Alex's story. Alex is an amazing young man who has the superpowers of autism. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alex. How are you?
I'm well. How are you, April? Thanks for having me.
Yes, wonderful. So I know many of our viewing audience don't know who you are or
Sure.
your story, but the first question I wanted to ask you is, who are you? Who's Alex Tallman?
Sure. So, yeah, I guess just to give a brief overview of myself, my name's Alex Tallman. Feel free to call me Al. Um, 25 years old, currently reside in New Jersey, work out in California for Apple. Um, Harvard graduate in graduate school right now, back at Harvard, working on my master's degree in economics. And as you mentioned, someone who has autism, has lived with autism, managed to overcome, quite a few of the obstacles. Although, it's a journey and it's one that I'm still on, and just eager to share my story and help out other people where I can.
I love it. I love it. So my first question, just to dive right into today, not sure we are, interview, is when did you officially learn about your superpower of autism?
From a very young age, I dropped out of preschool because I wasn't really quite fitting in class. And I think from about the age of 3 or 4, my parents and probably my teachers knew that something was, I'll say, different about me. It really started to manifest itself pretty severely in second grade. Second grade was when I went through a lot of trials for school, started not passing subjects, had a lot of separation anxiety from my mother, from my family, and got to the point where I really wasn't even able to stay a full school day. And so that's when it really kind of reared its head. And, at the time, this was maybe 2002, 2003, the part of the autism spectrum where I think, kind of my autistic flavor, if you will, falls, was not very explored, kind of that Aspergian, sort of varietal, I'll say. And so took my parents quite a bit of searching to find the right neurologist, the right cognitive therapist that could effectively say, yes, we think he is on the spectrum. This is the sort of particular type of autism that we think he's dealing with. And these are some of the ways it manifests. And once we got the diagnosis is when things started to piece together, the inability to socialize in preschool, the separation anxiety, some of the more obsessive habits, that type of thing. So to answer your question succinctly, I think we firmly got a diagnosis when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old.
Okay, awesome. So you already started to describe some of the trials that you experienced in school. Can you share any more trials that you may have experienced, either in elementary school or in the middle school years?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, to be frank, those were probably the most challenging years personally. That was at a time when, as I mentioned, people really didn't know a lot about Asperger's, didn't know a lot about the full breadth of the autism spectrum. And, for me, there were really two main issues that I had. One was, being bullied pretty mercilessly. And I think that's true of a lot of people with autism, because we tend to approach things differently. And, when you're in your 20s or when you're in the workforce, you can appreciate a different perspective. But when you're 6, 7, 8, maybe all the way up to the end of high school, different perspectives kind of scare you. And so a lot of bullying that took place. And, in addition to that, I struggled tremendously academically. I really couldn't read effectively up until probably the 4th or the 5th grade, maybe even later. I might not be remembering that 100% correctly. A mixture of it was just, lack of desire. And, it just also frustrated me, and it wasn't something I had an interest in doing. So lot of trials academically, did not really become a good student until 7th grade. to be frank with you. Really didn't understand the academic process. The way of learning in public school just wasn't really well suited to how I digest information. So yeah, up until I'd say seventh grade, it was very difficult socially and academically.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. So, when you talk about the academic struggles that you have, I know just thinking about having worked in education with individuals who are autistic, what is your preferred learning style? How do you learn and process information best?
It's interesting. The more people on the autism spectrum that I encounter, your son Jarrell being one of them, the more I find that people learn a lot like me. I think in public schools today, kind of in the age of standardized testing, which was what I grew up with, the No Child Gets Left Behind Act, that type of thing, there was this idea that everyone learns the same way. And if we just standardize learning and standardize the assessments, that will sort of raise that lowest common denominator. For me, I don't learn best in a classroom. I don't learn best by looking at the teacher when she's or he is talking. And that was always a consistent struggle with me. I find it easier to pay attention if I'm actually looking at something else, not the instructor. Just more of an kind of an audio learner. But I would say generally, to kind of get at it this way, I find I do best when I'm sort of self-teaching, because I know my particular style of learning. I know what types of problems I need to do, what types of exercises, study routines I need to get into to really absorb information. Not to say that the school system I went through for most of my life was inadequate. It just wasn't suited to that. It was only once I got to college where I could say, I can teach myself this. I don't have to go to class. If I do go to class, I don't have to stare at the professor, make eye contact, seem engaged. They don't really care at that level of academia. So I would say definitely more of a self-learner, not as suited for kind of the standardized tests, traditional classroom model.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. So, my next question to you is this, Alex. Tell me one or two things you would want to tell your younger self on how to move through your journey.
I would say that the first thing, and this is something I've talked about with a lot of people. I never publicly spoke about the fact that I had autism until actually you and I did our first live interview. I want to say maybe back in the summer or early fall. So for the first, call it 24, 25 years of my life, this was a very well kept secret. And most of that was due to kind of the stigma that I think is created around people with autism. There's a general perception that people with autism are maybe less intelligent or less capable, when that's exactly, that's completely not the case. So I think if I had two things to tell my younger self, the first one would just be to, love yourself. As hyperbolic as that sounds, learn to appreciate the gifts that you have by virtue of being autistic. Things like great pattern recognition, memory recall, being able to really dive in, teach yourself things, and understanding that having autism is not a disability, it's an ability. The way that I can view problems that other people with similar, who have similar types of autism to me can view problems is very different, and in some cases even better than the way people without autism view them. So I think just overall learning that you're not less than, that you have a lot of really great assets and attributes that you bring to the table that nobody else can bring to the table. And it's by virtue of being autistic. That's so key. Because the reality is, even today, while we do know more about these types of autism and whatnot, there's still the stigma that you're less than, that you can't quite do everything that someone without autism or a normal person could do. And I think for me, what's important is really hammering home the point that that is not the case. It is demonstrably false.
Yes, wise words of wisdom. So let me ask you this. What do you want parents and advocates to know when it comes to supporting someone who's autistic?
I would say to start, we mentioned there's kind of a bad stigma, a negative stigma around people with autism. in my mind, and for me in my life, where that changed was with the parent, with the advocate. They are the people that, young folks with autism interact with daily. They're their biggest champion, and oftentimes they could also be the biggest critic, rightfully so. So I'd say for parents and advocate, that paradigmatic shift starts with you. It starts with us. It starts with treating people, be it children or folks we're mentoring or helping, as though, the same way that we would treat anyone else. I think that's probably the biggest point to hammer home, is that kind of grassroots, paradigmatic change really starts with the parents, with the advocates.
Great, 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 great. So now you've already finished high school, finished college, starting college again, but you're also in the workforce. So
Yeah.
tell me, what would you like your future or even your current colleagues to know about supporting your needs when it comes to your unique learning profile?
I would say this applies to current, former colleagues, and even some current and former professors and instructors. Not everybody learns the same way. And I think that can manifest itself in that sometimes you have to teach someone the same lesson more than once. I was someone, particularly when I got into the workforce, that was when I felt I really started to flourish. That was when there is no structured classroom environment. You do have to go do the self-learning, particularly for someone like me, where I had no academic training in my field of endeavor. Most of it was self-taught. You just, had to go out there, do it yourself. So I would say just the current, former colleagues, teachers, etc. It's just that not everyone learns the same way. And I think particularly people with autism have a very different style of learning, but once it clicks, it really clicks. And that's when you're kind of off to the races.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Now, how about for employers? What can they do to support you on the job so that you are successful and you are flourishing?
It's a great question. We touched on what parents and advocates can do and that kind of advice, but I think, to be frank, especially when in the workplace, as you become an adult, as you leave home and go off to college and to work, whatnot, you have to be your biggest advocate. And, we mentioned different styles of learning, different behaviors, maybe different ways of digesting information. But those are things that once you become an adult, people aren't going to ask you. You really have to advocate for yourself. And so I'd really uh, stress that is being able to go out there, say what you're good at, but also say where maybe you need a little help or where you need information or feedback delivered differently to make it easier for you to understand and take with you.
Good, good. And our final question for today's interview is this. Where do you see yourself possibly 3 to 6 months from now after having done this interview?
Well, as I mentioned, I reside in New Jersey and spend a good amount of time out here in California working for Apple. I'd say in the next 3, 6, maybe even 12 months, would like to stay with Apple, kind of continue progressing my career there. I'm at the halfway point in my master's degree, so hopefully within the next year can finish that, not fail out. And then, who knows where things are going to take me. I think I'm very fortunate in that I do have some options, and ultimately it's in God's hands. So we'll see where I go.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Alex. You are an amazing champion when it comes to supporting not only young adults, but children on the autism spectrum. Once again, my name is Dr. April J. Lisbon, and thank you for joining us on another episode of Finding the Superpowers Within. I hope that you like and share this interview with your friends, as well as your colleagues who either may have children on the autism spectrum or may be autistic themselves. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.